Welcome to today's talk. My name is Giacomin, and today I'll be discussing the design of autonomous vehicles from the point of view of the human experience. So just a quick reminder, what is the human-centered design point of view? What is the human experience point of view? Human-centered design is a set of techniques which interact, empathize, try to understand the people that we're designing for. It can be considered a form of structured empathy. We're not all perfectly empathic individuals, and these are a set of methods and techniques which help us to learn more about the people we're designing for and come to understand their needs and desires, their points of view on things, so that we can translate these into requirements or specifications in design. It leads typically to product systems and services which are physically, perceptually, cognitively, and above all, emotionally intuitive to use. So it leads to things which should seem fairly natural and pleasant to the people involved. So human-centered design involves many different activities. There's a large amount of activities as shown in the diagram at the base of the type human factors and ergonomics. There's a lot of science of people, a lot of psychology, sociology, anthropometry, biomechanics. There's a lot of knowledge about what people can do and can't do, what they like, what they don't like, what makes them happy, what makes them sad. And these basic facts are a fundamental part of human-centered design. But then there's also a lot of user experience design or interaction design or UX. Further, there's obviously quite a lot of effort put into semiotics and discourse and narrative and stories. Aesthetics, for example, product aesthetics will fall under this category of consideration. And at the very top of the diagram is the very fundamental concept which we always try to work to, which is the meaning which people are most likely to associate with the artifact, whether it's a product or system or a service, when they interact with them, with it, when they use it, and when they experience it in their life. So thinking of the human-centered design point of view and then looking at what's happening with autonomous vehicles, we see that this is a new technology. It's evolved very rapidly, and within a span of a few years, we've seen quite a variety of products being tested, and the first ones are starting to appear on public roads at the moment. We have pods, we have buses, things that look like a traditional bus or shuttle. We have vehicles which look a little bit more like the 20th century stereotype of the automobile for the family or the commercial use. So there's a wide variety of machines being tested, a wide variety of applications. In today's discussion, we will assume that the technology will evolve and the technology will work well at some point. There's too many talented people and too much funding going into the sector for it not to begin to work and work safely and reliably in the near future. So assuming that the sensors, the guidance systems, the mapping systems, the vehicle-vehicle communications, vehicle-to infrastructure communications, the algorithms, the backup safety systems, assuming that all of this will probably evolve and reach a reasonably mature state where it's working fairly well, the question then still remains, what will be the human experience of these friendly neighborhood robots? So when we encounter them and we use them to go somewhere in the future, what will that be like? And what characteristics, what parameters, what design considerations will we need to decide things about when we're designing these things for use by people? One very important consideration, anthropomorphism, the tendency to attribute human characteristics to inanimate objects. When we see the clouds, when we see the man in the moon, when we see all kinds of machines and we get mad at them as if they did things on purpose, these are all manifestations of a natural characteristic of the human nervous system, which is to see faces, to recognize shapes, and to assign intentionality and causality to events. To make sense of the great confusion there is in the world out there. Our brains are looking for causes and looking for reasons or intentions behind the causes. So even when we look at something like an automobile, a van, a bus, a train, an airplane, we tend to see faces, and we tend to identify behaviors, and we tend to talk about these machines as if they had an intentionality, as if they were people quite often. So anthropomorphism is a very natural thing, and it's hardwired in our nervous system, in our subcortical circuitry. So it's not something that's going away anytime soon. So anthropomorphism, from a design perspective, raises many questions because, as indicated in this slide, it takes only very small similarities and very minor degrees of anthropomorphic shape or behavior to lead to the natural tendency to anthropomorphize, to see motivations, to see intentions, and to occasionally treat the machine as if it were an animal or a person. So anthropomorphism, as illustrated here, can be achieved in many ways. You can have direct anthropomorphic representations where things do look like people or look like animals. You can have abstract versions, you can have iconicized versions, but the thing is, any of these will tend to trigger quite strongly the anthropomorphic interpretations and behaviors of people. And with road vehicles, particularly automobiles, many studies have been performed over the years, and anthropomorphism has been seen in all kinds of ways and all kinds of situations. So whether it's the front or the back of the car, they do look a little bit like a face. In the past, a little bit more smiling, a little bit more aggressive these days, but faces appear on vehicles, they appear on buildings, they appear on airplanes, trains. A face is quite often designed into most things due to the natural tendency of anthropomorphism and the fact that a face is actually a pleasant thing to see in front of a person. In this study, it's looked at instead the aggressiveness or dominance projected by the front of a vehicle, and it's made comparisons and done investigations in relation to known psychological responses of people where a face ratio of a certain type will tend to project the person as appearing more dominant or more aggressive. Vehicles, when the study was performed and compared to the responses obtained with images of humans, the images of road vehicles showed the exact same tendency. So face ratio dominance, which occurs with human-to-human interactions, occurs with vehicle. This is one example. I could be citing any one of several dozen research studies over the years where various things that we do and ways we judge people are being applied exactly the same to the vehicles when we see the vehicle in front of us. Anthropomorphism doesn't just apply to simple things like happy, sad, aggressive, dominant, and so forth. It also applies to things like the overall judgments of trust, reliability, or other higher order constructs. So things like trust in the vehicle. Do you trust the autonomous vehicle to drive safely, not make accidents, drive responsibly? And several studies, including this one, have shown how the amount of trust people declare in the system is directly proportional to how anthropomorphized the autonomous vehicle was made as part of the tests. The big issue, the really big issue with anthropomorphism is the way people assign intentionality. For example, a very obvious example is this one here, a study of medicine delivery robots in a hospital setting, so little autonomous robots that went around taking the medications from room to room or operating theater to operating theater. It was noted that when the robots, the exact same machines, were explained to the staff and introduced with mechanical names, X53 or something like that, when instead they were introduced with human names, the difference in approach, the fact that the robot was explained, introduced, and called something clearly machine-like, or introduced and called something much more anthropomorphic, much more human, it then led to a large number of episodes, such as the one that's mentioned here, which, oh, Betsy made a mistake, in the case of the anthropomorphized explanation of the exact same robot in the exact same hospital on the exact same ward, or in the case of the machine-like explanation, the stupid machine doesn't work. So we have also the fault tolerance, also the social interaction, also the ability or the willingness to engage with the device is clearly depending for the exact same device on whether we made bigger the anthropomorphism through its name and the explanation and certain minor characteristics, or whether we try very hard to make it clear this is a repetitive machine which is only doing something on a fixed track, and it's only doing a very simple task of a fixed nature. So depending on how it's designed, how it's explained, we get a totally different interaction with the people involved. And this is a great issue with anthropomorphism. Therefore, it does appear that the designers of our friendly neighborhood robots going forward will have to give some serious consideration right from the start. And much of what we're saying today and discussing today is about concept development. It's in the early stages of the design process, as opposed to perhaps prototyping or testing further downstream. Everything we're discussing today is relating to specifications, directions, and concept development. So it seems that already from concept development, or perhaps even at the specification level, decisions will have to be taken whether we are attempting as an organization to produce a friendly neighborhood robot that is a non-thinking tool, that is similar perhaps to the industrial robots we see in factories, and thus every aspect of its design is consistent with this intention. Or alternatively, possibly because it does have some social and psychological benefits out on the road in real usage, we may find ourselves having to design something that's much closer or much more of a sentient assistant, or a pretending to be sentient assistant. So it does appear clear, due to the anthropomorphizing tendencies in people, that depending on what we actually hope the machine will be able to do for people and how it will help them, we may have to make some preliminary decisions as to whether we go down the route of it's a machine, treat it as a machine, only attempt to use it as a rather limited, repetitive device, or it's rather flexible, it has many functions, it may even talk to you, it may even act at times as a companion when there's no human beings around. So this is a decision which does seem very important for designers to take in early stage. And assuming a decision about that has been taken, then a whole series of human-centered design considerations come into play. The very first one, the name. Names carry a lot of baggage with them. Names are not arbitrary, valueless parameters. From linguistics and studies of naming of artifacts, historically, we know that there are psychological and sociological expectations which tend to come with given names. For example, human names for people. Study, as indicated here, 500 college students. Names were presented to them with a question. Imagine that you are about to meet, let's say, Samantha. How competent or warm or old do you think she is when you see her name? So, assuming you're going to meet a person with name X, how competent do you think the person will be? Or how old do you think that person with a name like that might be? Or how warm or friendly do you think a person with that name might be? A study performed a few years back names break into categories, fall into categories, and we have quite a variety. We have warm but less competent names, competent names, names of low warmth and low competence. So we have expectations, rightly or wrongly. Maybe they're based on stories we read or movies we saw on TV or people we've met in real life. Whatever the sociological drivers of these stereotypes and expectations might be, the fact of the matter is they do exist. They may change over time, they may need constant monitoring, but they're out there, and when the designer chooses a name, there is a consequence associated with that selection. And names don't just apply to individuals, unfortunately, but names are fundamental in terms of group attribution. So here's one example, that both this and the previous, we could have cited many different examples. In this example of group attribution, we have a study where a robot in Germany was given either a German name or a Turkish name, and it was introduced to a group of people as having been designed and built either by a German company or a Turkish company. And when various questions were put to the people and questionnaires were filled out, it became obvious that all of the associations and all of the stereotypes related to ethnic or social group were being associated to the robot in the same way it would be associated with people. So whatever likes or dislikes a person might have had in relation to their national colleagues who are German, or to people of a foreign descent, perhaps immigrants to their country, these same attitudes and behaviors were rapidly projected onto the robotic system as if it was a person. So the names are also leading robots to be associated with social groups, political ideologies, perhaps political parties, and many other types of groupings that people tend to think about in their everyday life. And one big observation that needs to be considered in the design phase of these autonomous vehicles: names do tend to follow, historically, they have followed at least up to now, a general law of name development. Analysis performed in various academic professions looking historically at the naming of animals, whether they be dogs, cats, oxen, horses, sheep, the naming of animals from the beginning of written history to today, or the naming of machines, the first steam engines, the first presses, the first cars, the first airplanes, and so forth. In both cases, the naming trajectory seemed to follow a general pattern where when an animal was first introduced into a society, or a machine such as the train, the steam engine, was first invented and began to appear in towns, the first contact with these new realities was facilitated in most cases by the people involved attributing names to the animals or machines which were practical descriptions of the animals or machines. So an oxen could have been called Big Brown, or he could have been called the oxen from that country if that particular herd was typical of another region or another country. Machines like steam engines, they were given names like Quick and Rapid, or Fiery Fred, or something like this, and they were given names that would bring to mind the combustion, the fires, the steams, the speed of locomotion, the ability to haul heavy loads, and so forth. So there's a general law of name development which has been proposed by various researchers, and there's lots of historical evidence for this. Now, whether in the 21st century, saturated by information, news and social media, with the internet, with email, with LinkedIn and all kinds of other tools, whether in the 21st century there will be a similar pattern, or needs to be a similar pattern for autonomous vehicles, is something yet to be seen. However, historically it has facilitated the introduction of these machines into new environments. So it might be the case that some autonomous platforms might wish to have names which are fairly self-explanatory as to what they do, just to make the first contact between the machines and the public more simpler, more straightforward, more intuitive, and more enjoyable. This is something we will have to see. Meaning, a big issue of human-centered design, as shown at the beginning in the triangle with meaning at the top. Meaning is an absolutely fundamental issue to discuss during design meetings, when taking design decisions, when performing design process. A large study of meaning performed by myself some years back, looking at the literature from philosophy, linguistics, psychology, sociology, ergonomics, human factors, engineering, science, technology, business, law, looking at a wide range of professions at the literatures over the last few hundred years, it became obvious that meanings tend to fall into three macro categories, three large categories. Those categories can be further subdivided, and in different disciplines, some of the words or some of the terms used to discuss these categories might be slightly different. There are variations, but there's no doubt that there's three sources of meaning, or three types of meaning, which reoccur over and over again in the literature, and which have been greatly debated and discussed in fields such as linguistics, philosophy, psychology, and sociology. Now, one of the first of the three is function, the way something operates, its natural purpose. The fact is that in this world, some things need doing, with or without aesthetic or semiotic content. There are many situations in which we need to perform an action or achieve a goal, and the only point or the only meaning behind the artifacts we're using is to reach that goal. And the world is full of such examples of functional devices. A second category of meaning is ritual. Ritual, series of actions or behaviors which are done regularly and possibly invariably by someone, or by a group of people, or perhaps by a complete nation of people, often as part of a ceremony or a public demonstration of something. So we are not just creatures who spend the day doing certain tasks and certain activities over and over again without any particular thought to it, or without noticing that other people are watching us and seeing what we're doing and are benefiting from our activities. We are complex creatures, and we manifest our complexity also by simplifying our life into certain rituals, and these rituals have deep meaning for us. They're repetitive, therefore they simplify our life. By performing the same ritual each day, it makes my life simpler, easier, things get done quicker, and it's more enjoyable and more obvious what it is I wish to pay attention to and what I wish to enjoy. Basically, some actions are performed for their aesthetic and semiotic content almost as much as they are for the functional, practical outcome they achieve. And quite often, these actions involve motions which send messages to other people, or they involve situations which seem to be meaningful and which send messages to other people. So think of having your morning coffee, or having your morning donut, or think of situations where you meet people for lunch and you have a chat at the same grill or the same restaurant each afternoon. There are certain activities which achieve some outcomes, but there's much more to it than simply the outcome. There's also how you do it, what you emphasize, and what the other people think of you, because you do tend to do this quite often. So there's rituals, it's a second category of meaning, and many artifacts are designed to support ritual. And then the third category is myth, a traditional story, especially one about the early history of somebody, some group of people, or some society. Quite often idealized, exaggerated, simplified, filtered. It's not a historical account of what actually happened. It's a story, a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and end, with motivations and drivers and thoughts and emotions, actions, and then results, consequences, morals of the story. So myths are organizing narratives. They're stories which help us to interpret the complex world we live in. They're often models or examples that can be followed by us as well if we aspire to living our life in the same way as our heroes. Some things are purely aesthetic or semiotic in content. Motions or actions might not be necessary. Stories and the feelings they transmit don't require an action or an outcome to be performed at that moment. Sitting at an art gallery, observing your favorite painting or sculpture could fall into the category of narrative story and transmission of values without anything actually occurring that's visible to other people. You're feeling something, you're thinking something, some story is evolving in your mind, but it's not necessarily visible to others. So there's three large categories of meaning and many, many practical design situations where we target specific meanings, fit into one or the other of these, and occasionally some products, systems, or service will have possibly a dominant meaning, but then provide some support for the other two categories as well. When it comes to vehicles, just to give a very trivial example of meanings, some of the autonomous vehicles in the future will be purely functional in nature, such as this mail delivery robot, which is managing to climb the steps of someone's home to deliver the post to the door. Some of them will be more ritualistic, meaning they also have an aesthetic and a semiotic content to them. The school bus being a great example. It's big, it's yellow, it has doors in certain places, it has certain writings on it. This is what we expect. We expect a little sign to come out and say stop when it's pulled over at the curb and it's letting the children off. So that isn't just a vehicle that can be optimized in any random way that makes it more efficient. That's a vehicle which will have to be designed following some of the expectations and stereotypes associated with its natural ritual. And then of course myth, narrative, story, value system, that sort of design objective will be the design objective for many of the vehicles going forward in the future as well. The sports car, the sports experience, the racing experience is unlikely to completely disappear just because the vehicles no longer necessarily need a driver. That sort of experience, there probably will be vehicles which support also those kinds of objectives. Then from a human-centered design point of view, if we have some decisions about anthropomorphism, if we have some decisions, we got some very good names selected for our design, if we've also clarified a little bit the main meanings, which meaning or which combination of meanings we're targeting, then there's a very important matter of metaphor. Vehicles tend to have traditional metaphors. Metaphor being a system of ideas and thoughts and properties and parameters which come along with a word or a symbol or an artifact or a picture or a photo. These are values, parameters, data, colors, design information which comes with the thought pattern that we're thinking. So if someone says cat, we will naturally, with the word cat, we will naturally find that coming along with the word as baggage will be the rest of the metaphor, which may include the fact it has 4 legs, might include a tail, might have whiskers, might have fur, might have even a color to the fur, sees well in the dark. There will be all kinds of thoughts which naturally come as a bundle with the word cat or with the metaphor cat. The same applies to vehicles. Traditional metaphors for road vehicles, we have the road vehicles we're all familiar with, the ones that are out in the parking lot back here. Personal transport, company car, rental car, public taxi. There are certain metaphors which over the last 100 years have developed, been refined, entered our society, become part of our everyday experience, become part of many people's lives. So these are metaphors designers will have to consider, because before you break away from a traditional metaphor, you will have to ask some important questions as to whether the autonomous vehicle, the specific one you're designing, whether it is really close to one of these, and by trying to break away from it, you're just confusing the situation, or whether these are too constraining and limited and would confuse, and thus you need to emphasize where the differences lie. New metaphors, which are developing almost on a daily basis at the moment. Public shuttles is fairly familiar. It's not completely new, but we have people talking about mobile offices, mobility services for special communities, whether they be elderly individuals, special needs individuals, children with schools, and so forth. Entertainment centers. There's a lot of discussion about autonomous vehicles for tourism purposes in a local area. Entertainment centers, which perhaps are the mobile version of a 1980s video arcade, etc., etc. So there's lots of new metaphors developing, and it's going to be very important to clarify which parameters exactly we wish to emphasize for each metaphor, and whether we wish to discuss them in a manner that has any overlap or similarity to the traditional ones that people are familiar with. And the metaphors that are evolving at the moment, you can very clearly see from the things you see in the news that they're spreading over a spectrum. And the spectrum, you can analyze it in this manner. You can talk about there being one anchor at the utilitarian end. There are certain machines being discussed and a few being put on the road at the moment, which are incredibly functional and very helpful for doing very basic tasks at airports, train stations, and city centers, and so forth. On the other end of the spectrum, perhaps a little bit more fluid and abstract at the moment in rapid development, we have what can be labeled as hedonic or value-laden or emotionally engaging designs, which are not always specifically for practical reasons, but they are opportunities for entertainment, enjoyment, tourism, and other possibilities, which is part of human life, and people also need that and not just simple transport. So we can see that the various traditional and new metaphors are rapidly spreading over a spectrum, and as a design decision right at the concept development stage, absolutely fundamental to agree with the organization that set the brief, or the sponsors or the people funding the project, where it is we're trying to target here, because they lead to different requirements and different capabilities. Then, once we've gotten this far, comes more practical details. We get into the nitty-gritty of design. Interaction design. Very important to design our autonomous vehicle for appropriate interactions, ethical interactions, friendly interactions that people will accept and enjoy as part of their life. So if we can agree some target metaphors for the project, and we can agree some target personas for the project, and if we can agree some target scenarios, the make or break locations and social settings and economic pressures which our machine, our friendly neighborhood robot, will have to meet. Once we deploy these more or less standard design tools, the metaphor, the persona, the scenario, we can then say, putting these together, we have a certain number of theoretical idealized customer journeys. And those customer journeys can be detailed breakdowns of what the interaction with the friendly neighborhood robot should be like. So I go on my cell phone or talk to Alexa in my household, and I ask for some autonomous service to show up at the doorstep because I need to go somewhere. From the moment that first contact is made with the portal, we will have a customer journey which can be broken down almost in a minute-by-minute basis, and we can consider each of these touch points or interactions, either with the service or the friendly neighborhood robot itself. What should be the interaction design? What should be the relationships? What are the design parameters we should give to the autonomous platform to do a reasonable job across all these instances and all these data exchanges and all these interactions that will occur. So customer journeys are fairly routine, fairly standard design tool. We will need to, of course, deploy them very carefully in the case of autonomous vehicles. And then, of course, as I said at the beginning of the talk, there's an enormous amount of human factors and ergonomics involved in any sort of product, system, or service design, which is intended principally to be used by people, particularly people who are acting as customers or users of a public service or a commercial service. So looking at the human factors, we have 100 years or more of research, and for road vehicles we have a fairly well developed understanding of some of the basics of postural comfort, motion comfort, vision, traction, control of the vehicle, motion sickness, a big issue for autonomous platforms. There's a fairly substantial body of knowledge related to these, so I won't be talking too much today about it. I'll just note that there are design resources and design tools out there which provide quite a bit of support. For example, a fairly well-known book by Bizet from a few years back. If we just look at the structure of this gentleman's book, automotive ergonomics, controls, lighting, modeling, driver vision, vehicle evaluation methods, workload measurements, driver's performance measurement. You can see even just from the one textbook, even though it is quite substantial text, you can see there's pretty good coverage in the literature of the main human interactions, what's natural, what's not natural, what causes workload or fatigue, where driver errors occur, where motion sickness might arise, and so forth and so on. So human factors, fortunately, we have a lot of resources available. Some further work is ongoing at the moment, particularly in areas like motion sickness. There's and trust in the reliability of the device. There's a lot of research in those areas. However, we're very lucky that we can benefit from a lot of resources, many of which just 30, 40 years ago were not yet available, but we're lucky today as designers we have these resources. And then finally, a very fundamental topic, possibly all design is destined in the future to become ethical design. Once safety and comfort and quality and reliability and experience and even things like meaning and metaphor are well designed for, once they become so routine and so well designed for that most artifacts are incredibly satisfying from those points of view, there will remain always the issue of the ethics involved, because ethics is about people's values and things people agree and don't agree in society, and that does change. So that's not going to be something that's a problem that's solved at any time soon. It's a moving target, and it's a complex issue, and it's probably an area where there's not really an obvious right or wrong to most of the questions. So looking at ethics, how does this fit into the human experience of autonomous platforms? Well, first of all, as designers, we have a responsibility to consider the fact that, as stated here in this lovely text by Csikszentmihalyi, in this text of the 1980s, which was called The Meaning of Things, this gentleman clarified many things related to the value systems and the meanings people associate, particularly the things in their home. The studies were mostly about the home. But taking one key statement out of that textbook, a key statement which has much support in the field of philosophy, some of the sources going back several millennia, Mihaly's statement is a very good, concise summary. The objects that people use, despite their incredible diversity and sometimes contradictory usage, appear to be signs of a blueprint that represents the relationship of people to themselves, people to other people who might be around them that they work with, people of their family, friends, and neighbors, and the relationship of the people the person, to the universe in which they live. So the artifacts we design, and the autonomous vehicle will be no exception to this, the artifacts which we design are intermediaries, they're facilitators, they're in between us and other people, they're in between us and the universe. Yes, it would be hard to walk from here to Nottingham, but the autonomous vehicle will get me there maybe in an hour and a half or two in a much easier manner. So they're obvious facilitators or intermediaries of physical things, but they're also intermediaries between me and other people, and something that's not always obvious to all designers, they're intermediaries between us and ourselves. Because when I start thinking about how I'm going to get to Nottingham today, the availability of an autonomous vehicle and its very nature, something a designer provided for me, is going to enter into my thoughts, and it's going to be one of the things I evaluate. And it might have requirements, or it might push me in directions which are different from what I initially started thinking when I began to ponder upon what I should do today to get to Nottingham. So artifacts of any type, natural or man-made, are intermediaries between us and the three possible sources of dialogue, as it were, in this universe. And the autonomous vehicle we're designing, as designers, we have the responsibility to ensure that as an intermediator, the autonomous vehicle is as ethical as possible and hopefully does not violate obvious ethical principles. Now, when it comes to the ethics of autonomous vehicles, a very tricky business, because ethics itself is a very complex matter. Here in this slide, we have an example where we mention there's a large number of ethical theories. Most textbooks of ethics will have over 20 basic frameworks or theories or ways of thinking which are worth considering and have had some role or some influence in some social decisions, some political decisions that have been taken over the years. So there's certainly more than 20 quite valid, quite consistent, quite logically complete frameworks for thinking about ethics. Now here I've put on the slide only a small number of the most popular ones that tend to appear and reappear in all textbooks and treatises about ethics. Whether we're talking about ethical egoism, utilitarianism, virtual ethics, social contracts, feminist ethics, if we look here at what an example of a stereotypical key criteria might be, these are simplifications just to get them all on one slide. They're highly simplified, they're somewhat generalized, but if we just look at the statements of what a right action or right decision, the correct decision might be in the various cases according to the various frameworks, we can see very large differences. Just looking at ethical egoism and utilitarianism, one emphasizes the benefits and repercussions on the individual, the other one seeks to optimize happiness across society. Things like Kantian ethics are about doing the right thing because that's the agreed rule, that's the natural, logical rule that everyone should respect, and you have to follow it in all cases with no exceptions. And then things like social contract theory, the universe doesn't furnish absolutes. Even people can't agree between themselves either absolutes. So there's such a thing as a social contract. There's certain behaviors and certain things that we expect of people, and they will achieve certain benefits in response, thanks to the fact they follow those expectations or rules. So there's a wide range. It's clear that some appear to be almost contradicting the one next to it. So ethics is going to be a difficult area, and an area open for debate for a long time into the future with autonomous vehicles. However, it can be said that in most practical fields, most disciplines which touch upon engineering and science, we do have various resources which can be labeled as applied ethics resources. Applied ethics is one of the three main areas or subdivisions of ethics. It's the one that deals with practical, everyday recommendations of an ethical nature, agreed typically by experts and panels of people who are well informed about the issues involved and well informed on ethics theory. Applied ethics is, as it says at the top, the practical application of moral considerations. And in the case of autonomous vehicles, we're seeing a set of guidelines and resources evolving very rapidly at the moment. One guideline, which is already available from a couple of years ago and is actually rather helpful, British Standard 8611, Robots and Robotic Devices Guide to the Ethical Design Application of Robot Systems. Given that the autonomous vehicle is a form of robotic automation, this particular standard, agreed by a panel, a committee of experts in robotics and ethics and psychology and various disciplines, this provides quite a bit of useful guidance which the designer can take, consider, incorporate into design discussions, perhaps even test for some of the characteristics on the final design. So looking at what's in British Standard 8611, I'll only mention a couple points just to give a little flavor for it, but we can see that anthropomorphism, or the anthropomorphization of the robot, that was right near the beginning of the big table of the standard. It's one of the very first things that needs consideration. As I've already expressed, it greatly affects everything downstream from it. So once it's been anthropomorphized substantially, the robot, it's going to facilitate anthropomorphic interactions with the people. So that's something that needs to be considered, whether it's appropriate or not appropriate for the given robot and the given application, and to what degree. Other issues, for example, robotic or robot addiction. What happens when the autonomous vehicles or other forms of robots are so helpful, so useful, that we abandon all other forms of transport and mobility, and we're a bit lost and we can't really do things properly if we're completely, totally reliant on a given vehicle, a given service, a given form of mobility. Robot addiction is a fairly recent concern. It wasn't something we would have discussed 20, 30 years ago, but in British Standard 8611 it's been highlighted because it is a growing concern. Learning by the robots, their behavior perhaps outside the originally intended envelope of behavior. What happens when the autonomous platform is sufficiently sophisticated to learn new things about the roads and the environments and to begin taking decisions about how to get to places and which roads are better to drive on and which neighborhoods to go through? What happens when the autonomous vehicle is now taking on some of the responsibilities and some of the sentience that we would have expected from human beings? Might that go beyond what we had originally envisioned? Might that lead to decisions we wouldn't agree with? So the growing sophistication, the fact that the robotic, the friendly neighborhood robot might act in ways or do things outside of our intentions, outside of what we wished it to do, that's another growing area of concern. And then of course there's also fairly sophisticated considerations of not necessarily strictly a mobility related type, which is, what about the environmental impacts? What if our robot partners, what if the autonomous vehicles are performing the service adequately and meeting many human expectations, but they're doing it in a way that's not environmentally sustainable, or they're making decisions which are damaging to the environment, perhaps driving over a dirt track and damaging the dirt track, whereas they could have taken a slightly longer route over a paved surface and create less damage to the local environment. So there's lots and lots of ethical concerns which, once we give the autonomous platform the ability to take somewhat sophisticated decisions about the best ways to go about doing its service, there we have ethical possible concerns about, might the decisions that the machine is making not be fully consistent with what we intended to be, what we wished it to be, what the local community of people might agree should be the best way to do it. So ethics is a very wide, a very complex field. Fortunately, we do have a few tools such as British Standard 8611, lots of concerns, and as you can see, applied ethics are quite often guidelines, tables, standards, which are a bit of a mishmash of the main ethical theories or the main ethical frameworks, where elements are taken often from a different framework and put into the guidance based on the fact that that particular concern seems particularly relevant to a machine, in this case a machine that can perform its actions in a certain manner. So applied ethics, a bit of a mismatch. Mismatch. If we look at the table, we will see elements in there that do remind us of utilitarianism. Some others do look a little bit like they're driven by social contract. Others still might be quite obviously Kantian in nature or virtue ethics in nature. So applied ethics is trying to use some common sense, pick things which seem appropriate given the nature of the machine or the situation we're talking about. And of course, these are guidelines which have been, this consensus has been reached by a group of experts, by a group of people who are knowledgeable in the specifics, the applied of the applied ethics, and hopefully they represent common sense guidance as to what may or may not lead to difficulties later. Thus, they do provide some simple guidance that designers can match against when they're making their decisions and choosing the parameters for the vehicle. So, thank you very much for your time and your patience with today's discussion. I hope that some of the things we covered in this talk about autonomous vehicles, the human experience, I hope that some of this from a design point of view can be useful when designing autonomous platforms going forward. As I said, the talk was focused on the interactions and the issues which will most affect the people, particularly from a psychological, sociological perspective. We didn't touch upon the technologies, but it's very likely the technologies will be quite powerful and permit, as designers, permit us to make many different choices for achieving the same goals, and thus we then have to look at these human considerations to ensure we're making choices which will lead to friendly neighborhood robots which people will accept, will enjoy, and will welcome to their community. So thank you very much. Speak with you next time.